I always believed family was everything. If we stay loyal, I used to say, nothing can break us. Emily would smile when I said that. That night, she didn't smile. She sat across from me at the small kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cold mug. I laughed softly and said, "You're shaking. Are you sick?" She swallowed and whispered, "I need to tell you something." I leaned forward and said, "You're scaring me." She stared at the table and said, "I'm pregnant." My heart jumped. I laughed again and said, "You should have seen your face. You almost got me." She didn't laugh. I said, "Emily?" She whispered, "It's not yours." I felt my ears ring. "What do you mean it's not mine?" I asked. She pressed her hands to her face and said, "Please don't shout." I said, "Answer me." Her voice broke. I made a mistake. I stood up so fast the chair fell back. "With who?" I asked. She shook her head. "Say it," I said. "I can't," she cried. I slammed my hand on the table. "Say his name." She whispered, "Daniel." I laughed once, sharp and empty. "My brother?" I asked. She nodded. "You're lying," I said. "Say you're lying." She reached for me and said, "I'm sorry." I stepped back and said, "Don't touch me." I walked out of the apartment without shoes. The night air burned my lungs. I called Daniel. "Come outside," I said. "Now." He said, "What's wrong?" I said, "Don't act stupid." He came down in his hoodie, hands in his pockets. I said, "Did you sleep with my wife?" He looked at the ground. "Say no," I said. He stayed quiet. "Say no," I shouted. He whispered, "It wasn't planned." My chest felt crushed. "Answer me," I said. He said nothing. I laughed again. "You don't even have the courage to deny it." He said, "I never wanted to hurt you." I said, "You already did." I went back upstairs. Emily was sitting on the floor. "Please," she said, "I'll do anything." I said, "How long?" She said, "A few months." I asked, "Every family dinner?" She cried and nodded. I asked, "Every time he looked me in the eye?" She said, "I didn't know how to stop." I said, "You didn't try." She grabbed my leg. "Don't tell anyone," she begged. "Your parents will hate me." I said, "What about me?" She said, "I was lonely." I laughed. "I worked 2 jobs for us." She said, "I know." I said, "You chose my brother." She whispered, "I'm sorry." I locked myself in the bathroom and stared at my reflection. "This isn't real," I told myself. I remembered Daniel teaching me to ride a bike. I remembered my parents saying, "Family protects family." I remembered Emily saying, "I trust you." My phone buzzed. A message from my mother said, "Dinner Sunday." I felt sick. I went back out. Emily looked hopeful. "We can fix this," she said. I said, "You're carrying his child." She said, "But I'm your wife." I asked, "Why him?" She said, "He listened." I said, "So did I." She cried harder. "Please," she said, "don't tell them." I sat on the couch and said nothing. My mind screamed, but my mouth stayed closed. Emily said, "Say something." I said, "I need air." I went to the balcony and stared at the street. Cars passed. Lives continued. I thought, everyone is moving and I'm frozen. Daniel texted me, "I'm sorry." I didn't reply. Emily came behind me and said, "I'll leave if you want." I said, "You already left." She said, "I love you." I turned and said, "Love doesn't do this." She covered her stomach and whispered, "The baby didn't choose this." I said, "Neither did I." We sat in silence until dawn. When the sun rose, I realized something had died. I wasn't just losing my marriage. I was losing my brother. I was losing the version of myself who believed loyalty was enough. Emily fell asleep against the wall. I watched her breathe and felt nothing. I thought, this is what breaking feels like. I knew one thing for sure. My life before this night was gone, and whatever came next would never be the same again. I drove to my parents' house without thinking. My hands were shaking on the steering wheel. When my father opened the door, he said, "Come in," like it was any normal day. I stepped inside and said, "We need to talk." My mother was already crying. She said, "Sit down, please." I stayed standing and said, "You know." My father pointed at the chair and said, "Sit." I sat. He folded his hands and said, "Family honor comes first." I stared at him. "That's all you have to say?" I asked. My mother wiped her eyes and said, "Daniel made a mistake." I said, "He slept with my wife." My father said, lower your voice. I laughed and said, you're worried about noise? My mother said, Emily is pregnant. I said, with his child. She nodded like that fact hurt her more than me. My father said, what's done is done. I said, so is my marriage. He leaned forward and said, you will not destroy this family. I asked, who destroyed it? My mother reached for my hand. Please forgive them, she said. I pulled away and said, forgiveness isn't silence. My father said, in this house, it is. Daniel was sitting in the corner. I hadn't even noticed him. I stood up and said, say something. He looked at the floor. I didn't plan this, he said. I walked toward him. You planned every lie, I said. My father stood between us. Enough, he said. My chest burned. You're protecting him, I said. My mother cried harder. He's your brother, she said. I answered, he stopped being that. My father said, blood doesn't change. I said, neither does betrayal. My father told me to sit again. I did because I felt tired. He said, people must never know. I asked why. He said, because our name matters. I said, what about my life? He said, you're strong. I laughed. So, I have to suffer quietly? My mother said, just until the baby is born. I asked, and after? She stayed silent. Daniel finally looked up. I'll take responsibility, he said. I said, already took everything. He said, I'll help raise the child. I said, you already did. My father said, you will stay married. I said, you're deciding that? He said, I'm your father. I said, not my owner. My mother whispered, please don't ruin us. I looked at her and said, you're ruining me. She said, think of our reputation. I said, I am thinking of it. My father said, silence protects everyone. I said, everyone except me. He said, sometimes a man sacrifices. I asked, why is it always me? He didn't answer. I stood up slowly. So this is your solution, I said. I smile, I stay, and I pretend the child is mine. My father said, yes. My mother said, for the family. Daniel said nothing. I felt invisible. I said, you're asking me to live a lie. My father said, lies keep peace. I said, they kill people. My mother said, you're overreacting. I laughed again. I'm underreacting, I said. I haven't screamed yet. My father said, you will not. I looked at Daniel. Say you're sorry, I said. He said, I am. I said, say it louder. He said nothing. I clenched my fists. My father said, control yourself. I said, I'm the only one doing that. My mother said, promise us you'll stay silent. I felt trapped. The walls fell close. I thought, if I say no, I lose everyone. I said, fine. My father nodded. My mother cried with relief. Daniel whispered, thank you. I said, don't thank me. I drove home in silence. Emily was waiting. What do they say? She asked. I said, they want silence. She said, I knew it. I asked, you knew? She said, your parents always protect family. I said, they protected the wrong one. She touched my arm. We can survive this, she said. I pulled away. I don't know who we are anymore, I said. She cried and said, I'm scared. I said, so am I. That night, we lay in bed facing opposite sides. Emily whispered, say something. I stared at the ceiling and said nothing. She said, I'll spend my life making it up to you. I said, you can't undo this. She said, please don't leave. I thought about my parents' faces. I thought about Daniel's silence. I said, I won't. She exhaled. Thank you, she said. I didn't answer. I watched shadows move on the ceiling. My thoughts screamed. This isn't peace, I told myself. This is prison. Emily fell asleep. I stayed awake. I realized something painful and clear. Silence wasn't saving the family. It was burying me alive. I woke up next to Emily every morning and pretended nothing was wrong. She would say, good morning, and I would answer, morning, like my chest wasn't splitting open. At breakfast, she asked, did you sleep? I said, enough. She touched her stomach and said, the doctor says everything is fine. I nodded. Inside, I thought, nothing is fine. At dinner, she said, your parents invited us Sunday. I said, we'll go. She asked, are you okay? I said, I'm here. At my parents' house, my father laughed louder than usual. See, he said, Everything worked out. My mother smiled like silence had healed us. Daniel sat across from me, joking. You remember that trip? He asked. I stared at him and said, he laughed and said, good times. I thought, you're laughing on my life. Emily squeezed my hand under the table. My mother said, you look tired. I said, work. Daniel said, same here. I wanted to scream. I stayed quiet. On the drive home, Emily said, thank you for not making things awkward. I said, that's what you're worried about? She said, I mean, thank you for trying. I asked, trying to be fake? She sighed. I was lonely, she said. I said, I was there. She said, you were busy. I said, so you chose my brother. She went silent. I asked, why him? She said, I don't know. I laughed. You don't know? She said, it just happened. I said, it happened again and again. Nights were worse. We lay in bed, backs turned. Emily whispered, talk to me. I said, what do you want me to say? She said, tell me you don't hate me. I said nothing. She cried softly. I'm scared, she said. I answered, so am I. She said, we can still be a family. I asked, what family? She said, us. I said, there is no us anymore. She covered her face. Then why are you still here? She asked. I said, because I'm trapped. I stopped looking at mirrors. When I did, I saw a stranger. At work, Mark asked, you good? I said, yeah. He said, you look off. I said, just tired. He said, want to grab a drink? I said, another time. He frowned. You always say that. I said, I'm busy. He said, with what? I said, life. He nodded, but I knew he didn't believe me. Emily talked about baby names. What do you think of Lucas? She asked. I said, fine. She said, or maybe Noah. I said, whatever you want. She said, you don't care. I said, I can't. She said, this is your child too. I looked at her and said, don't say that. She flinched. You promised to stay silent, she said. I said, I didn't promise to forget. She said, please. I stood up and said, stop. Sleep stopped coming. I stared at the ceiling every night. Thoughts kept shouting. You're raising his child. You're lying to yourself. You're disappearing. Emily slept beside me, one hand on her stomach. I thought, this baby will call me father. I felt sick. One night I said, I can't do this. She asked, do what? I said, pretend. She said, for how long? I said, I don't know. She said, please don't leave me. I said, I already left. At another family dinner, my mother said, you seem calmer. I smiled. My father said, see, time fixes things. Daniel raised his glass. To family, he said. I lifted mine with shaking hands. To lies, I thought. Emily smiled like this was normal. My mother said, you'll be a great father. I nodded. Daniel looked away. For the first time, I saw fear in his eyes. It didn't comfort me. After dinner, I confronted Emily in the car. I'm breaking, I said. She said, I know. I asked, then why do you keep smiling? She said, because if I don't, everything falls apart. I said, it already did. She said, your parents need this. I said, what about me? She said, you're strong. I laughed bitterly. Everyone keeps saying that. She said, because you are. I said, strong people still bleed. One night, Mark showed up at my door. You vanished, he said. I said, I'm fine. He looked past me at Emily. Are you? He asked. I said, yeah. He said, you're lying. I snapped, drop it. He raised his hands. All right. As he left, he said, when you're ready, I'm here. His words stayed with me. I sat alone after everyone slept. I whispered to myself, silence is killing you. I realized the truth I'd been avoiding. Staying quiet hurt more than being betrayed. Living as a lie was slowly erasing me, and I didn't know how much longer I could survive it. I heard my parents laughing before I entered the living room. My father said, at least things worked out. My mother replied, yes, thank God he stayed quiet. I stopped walking. My chest tightened. I stepped inside and said, worked out for who? They froze. My mother said, you weren't supposed to hear that. I asked, did my pain ever matter? My father sighed and said, sit down. I said, answer me. He said, you need to be a man and move on. Something snapped inside me. I laughed and said, that's your solution? My mother stood up and said, lower your voice. I said, you lower my life. My father said, don't exaggerate. I said, you joked about my marriage. He said, we did what was best. I asked for who? He said, for the family. I said, I am the family. My mother cried. Please don't do this, she said. I said, you already did. Daniel walked in and said, what's going on? I looked at him and said, they're happy. He said, I never asked them to joke. I said, you asked them to protect you. My father said, enough. I said, no, my heart was pounding. You told me to stay silent. I said, you told me to bleed quietly. My father said, you survived. I said, I disappeared. My mother reached for me. We love you, she said. I pulled away. Love doesn't erase people, I said. My father said, where will you go? I said, somewhere I can breathe. He said, you're overreacting. I said, you underreacted to betrayal. Daniel whispered, I'm sorry. I said, sorry doesn't fix this. My father said, if you walk out, don't come back. I said, that's the first honest thing you've said. I went to my room and packed a bag. My hands were steady. Emily ran in and said, what are you doing? I said, leaving. She said, you can't. I said, watch me. She cried. Please don't go, she said. I said, I need space to breathe. She said they didn't mean it. I said, they meant every word. She grabbed my arm. What about the baby? She asked. I said, that's not how you keep me. She followed me to the door. Tell me where you're going, she begged. I said, I don't know. She said, when will you come back? I said, I won't. She gasped. You promised, she said. I said, I promise silence, not sacrifice. She cried louder. I can change, she said. I said, I've already changed everything. I walked out with my bag. The night air felt sharp. My phone buzzed. My mother texted, please come back. I didn't reply. My father called. I ignored it. Emily called. I turned the phone off. I drove without direction until the streets blurred. I found a cheap apartment with a flickering light and thin walls. The landlord asked, you staying long? I said, I don't know. He said, that works. The apartment was empty. I sat on the floor and listened to my breathing. Fear crept in. You're alone, my mind said. Relief answered, you're free. I laughed quietly. I unpacked my clothes and hung them in silence. My phone turned back on. Missed calls filled the screen. I didn't return any. I lay on the mattress and stared at the ceiling. It was different from the old one. Cleaner. Honest. Emily texted, I can't sleep without you. I typed, I couldn't sleep with you. I erased it. I sent nothing. My father texted, don't be dramatic. I blocked him. My mother sent a voice note crying. I deleted it without listening. My hands shook, but my chest felt lighter. I whispered, I choose myself. Saying it out loud felt strange and powerful. Days passed. I bought cheap furniture. I ate alone. I slept better. Mark called. Where did you go? He asked. I said, somewhere new. He said, are you okay? I said, I'm breathing. He paused. That's something, he said. I agreed. I ignored family calls. The silence felt different now. It was mine. One night, Emily showed up. She knocked until I opened the door. Her eyes were red. Please talk to me, she said. I said, we're talking now. She said, I'm scared. I said, so was I. She said, you're abandoning me. I said, I was abandoned first. She said, I need you. I said, I need myself. She cried. I can't do this alone, she said. I said, neither could I. She reached for me. I stepped back. I'm not your shelter anymore, I said. She whispered, I still love you. I answered, love shouldn't feel like drowning. She nodded slowly. So this is it? She asked. I said, this is me walking away. She left without another word. I sat on the floor after she left. My heart hurt, but it wasn't breaking anymore. I realized something clear and final. I would never again sacrifice myself to protect people who chose to break me. I signed the divorce papers with a steady hand. The lawyer said, are you sure? I said, yes. Emily sat across from me, eyes red. Please reconsider, she said. The baby deserves stability. I looked at her and said, I deserve honesty. She said, I made a mistake. I said, you made a choice. She reached across the table. We can still fix this, she said. I pull my hand back. Some things break past repair, I said. She cried. You're being cold, she said. I answered, I'm being alive. Outside, she followed me. You're really leaving, she said. I said, I already did. She said, your parents will never forgive you. I said, they never protected me. She said, you'll regret this. I said, I regret staying. She whispered, I loved you. I said, then you wouldn't have done this. I walked away while she was still crying. For the first time, I didn't turn back. Daniel called me that night. We need to talk, he said. I said, say it now. He showed up at my apartment, standing awkwardly. I want to take responsibility, he said. I said, you already did. He said, I'll raise the child. I said, you already are. He said, I'll apologize to everyone. I said, apologies don't erase betrayal. He said, I was weak. I said, you were selfish. He said, I'm your brother. I said, brothers don't do this. He lowered his head. What do you want from me? He asked. I said, nothing. He looked shocked. Nothing, he repeated. I said, I don't want your guilt or your promises. He said, then what? I said, I want my life back. He said, you're cutting me off. I said, you cut me first. He stood there silently. I hope you find peace, he said. I answered, I hope you learn what you destroyed. He left without another word. I started therapy the next week. The therapist asked, why are you here? I said, I stayed silent too long. She said, who taught you that? I said, my family. She said, and what did it cost you? I stayed quiet. She waited. I said, myself. She nodded. That sounds like emotional abuse, she said. I laughed bitterly. They called it love, I said. She said, love doesn't erase boundaries. I sat there breathing, feeling something loosen inside my chest. Mark met me after my session. You look different, he said. I said, I told the truth. He said, about time. I told him everything. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, they used you. I said, I let them. He said, you were trained to. I asked, how do I stop? He said, by choosing yourself. That sentence stayed with me. At work, I met Sarah during lunch. She said, mind if I sit? I said, sure. She asked, you okay? I almost said yes. Instead, I said, not really. She nodded and waited. I talked. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, she said, that sounds heavy. I said, it is. She said, how do you feel about it? No one had asked me that before. I thought and said, relieved and terrified. She smiled gently. Both make sense, she said. Emily texted me later. The doctor appointment is tomorrow. I replied, you should go with Daniel. She said, I want you there. I typed, I can't. She said, you're abandoning us. I replied, I'm choosing myself. She didn't answer. My mother called. I let it ring. My father left a message saying, you're selfish. I deleted it. Therapy became a place where I learned new words. Boundaries, my therapist said. Self-respect. I practiced saying them out loud. I told Mark, I'm not fixing this. He said, good. I told Sarah, I'm learning who I am. She said, take your time. I liked that she didn't rush me. One night, Daniel texted, Emily is struggling. I replied, so did I. He said, you're cold. I typed, I'm done. I blocked him. My hand shook, but my chest felt steady. Emily showed up once more. You're really doing this, she said. I said, yes. She said, what about our vows? I said, you broke them. She said, people make mistakes. I said, people face consequences. She said, you're changing. I said, I have to. She looked at me like she didn't recognize me. That felt right. Sarah asked me for coffee. As friends, she said. I said, I'd like that. We talked about small things. She asked, are you happy? I thought and said, I'm becoming honest. She smiled. That's better than happy, she said. That night, alone in my apartment, I said the words clearly. I choose myself. They didn't feel selfish. They felt necessary. For the first time, my life felt like it belonged to me again. Life didn't explode for them all at once. It cracked slowly. I noticed it in small things. Daniel stopped posting smiling photos. My mother started calling more often. I didn't answer. One afternoon, Mark said, you look lighter. I said, I stopped carrying other people. He nodded. Good. At work, Sarah asked, how's your week? I said, quiet. She smiled. Quiet can be healing. I believed her. Emily moved in with Daniel. She called me to tell me. I had no choice, she said. I answered, you always had choices. She sighed. He said he'd support us. I said he should. She hesitated. It's harder than I thought. I said, it usually is. She waited for more. I gave none. She said, you don't care. I replied, I care differently now. Daniel called a week later. I need help, he said. I asked with what? He said bills. I stayed quiet. He said, I'm struggling. I said, so did I. He raised his voice. You're punishing me. I said, I'm not saving you. He said, family helps family. I answered, family doesn't betray family. He hung up. My mother showed up at my apartment. People are talking, she said. I said, about what? She said, Emily living with Daniel. I said, that's their truth. She said, neighbors are asking questions. I said, answer them. She cried. You're enjoying this, she said. I shook my head. I'm not involved. She said, we protected you. I said, you protected yourselves. She left angry and scared. Emily called me late one night. Her voice was shaking. I can't sleep, she said. I said, you should rest. She cried. Daniel isn't who I thought he was. I said, neither were you. She sobbed. He gets angry. I said, that's between you and him. She said, he yells. I said, I won't step in. She whispered, I made a mistake. I said, yes. She waited. I said nothing. She said, why are you so calm? I said, because I stopped trying to control outcomes. She said, I need advice. I said, talk to someone who owes you. She cried harder. I thought you'd always be there, she said. I answered, you thought wrong. She said, you're cold. I said, I'm clear. She hung up. Daniel's messages came after. She's emotional, he wrote. I replied, handle it. He said, she compares me to you. I typed, don't. He said, she says you were better. I replied, stop messaging me. He wrote, you're enjoying this. I blocked him. At another family gathering, which I didn't attend, things fell apart. My father called later. People are asking questions, he said. I asked, did you tell the truth? He said, that's not the point. I said, it is now. He said, you could fix this. I answered, you could have fixed me. He went silent. Sarah noticed my phone buzzing. Everything okay? She asked. I said, not my problem. She smiled softly. That's progress. I said, I feel guilty sometimes. She asked for what? I said, for not rescuing them. She said, you're not responsible for consequences you didn't create. Her words settled deep. Emily called again days later. Daniel lost his job, she said. I said, I'm sorry to hear that. She snapped, that's it? I said, that's all I have. She said, we're barely managing. I said, I manage alone. She said, you've changed. I said, I had to. She whispered, I regret everything. I answered, regret doesn't rewrite history. My mother sent messages saying, come talk to us. I didn't go. My father wrote, you're tearing us apart. I replied, I stepped away. He said, that's the same thing. I didn't answer. Silence felt strong now. It wasn't fear. It was choice. Mark and I met for drinks. He said, they're unraveling. I said, I noticed. He asked, how does it feel? I thought and said, sad and free. He raised his glass. To freedom. I clinked mine. Emily sent one last message that night. I wish I listened to you. I typed, I wish you had too. I didn't add anything else. I want to sleep easily. Karma didn't arrive with shouting or revenge. It arrived quietly, like truth finding daylight. I didn't expose them. I didn't protect them. I simply stepped aside and let their choices speak. For the first time, my silence wasn't forced. It was powerful. My mother showed up without calling. When I opened the door, she looked smaller, older. Her eyes were tired. She said, can I come in? I stepped aside. She sat on the couch and said, you look well. I said, I'm stable. She nodded like that mattered. She folded her hands and said, we chose wrong. I stared at her. You protected Daniel, she said. We should have protected you. My chest tightened. I said, why now? She said, because everything is falling apart. I laughed quietly. So regret finally arrived. She flinched. We were scared, she said. I said, so was I. She said, we thought silence would fix things. I said, it broke me. She whispered, I see that now. I asked, did you see it then? She shook her head. We thought you were strong. I said, you mistook strength for sacrifice. She cried. I failed you, she said. I answered yes. She reached for my hand. I let her hold it for a moment. I'm angry, I said, but I'm also clear. She asked, clear about what? I said, that love without protection isn't love. She nodded slowly. Can you forgive us? She asked. I thought before answering. I can forgive, I said, but I can't go back. She whispered, that hurts. I said, so did silence. She stood up to leave. Your father wants to talk, she said. I said, I'm not ready. She nodded. Daniel is struggling, she added. I said, I know. She paused at the door. I'm proud of you, she said. I answered, I wish you were before. She left quietly. Daniel came that evening. He didn't knock. He stood in my doorway, looking angry and exhausted. You ruined my life, he said. I said, sit or leave. He stayed standing. You could have helped, he said. I said, you didn't ask for help when you betrayed me. He snapped, that was different. I laughed. It wasn't. He said, Emily is miserable. I said, so is I. He ran a hand through his hair. I'm drowning, he said. I said, you built the water. He shouted, you're enjoying this. I said, I'm surviving. He said, family stands together. I said, family doesn't destroy each other. He said, you're heartless. I said, I'm honest. He pointed at me. You think you're better than me? I said, I think I face consequences. He sat down heavily. I made a mistake, he said. I said, you made many. He said, I didn't mean to hurt you. I said, intent doesn't erase damage. He looked at the floor. What do you want from me? He asked. I said, nothing. He looked up. Nothing. I repeated, nothing. He shook his head. You've changed. I said, I had to. He stood up. I hope you're happy, he said. I answered, I'm at peace. He laughed bitterly. You always were the favorite, he said. I said, that's a lie you tell yourself. He opened the door and said, don't come to me when you need family. I said, I already learned how to live without it. He slammed the door behind him. A letter arrived days later. Emily's handwriting covered the page. She wrote, I finally understand. I read it slowly. She wrote about regret, fear, and loneliness. She wrote, I know I broke you. She wrote, I don't expect forgiveness. She wrote, I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. I folded the letter and put it away. I didn't reply. Silence was my boundary now. Mark asked me later, did you answer her? I said, no. He asked, do you feel bad? I thought and said, I feel finished. He nodded. That's different. I said, forgiveness doesn't mean access. He smiled. You're learning. Sarah noticed the letter on the table. Do you want to talk about it? She asked. I said, it's an apology. She asked, did it help? I said, it closed the door. She said, that matters. I said, I don't hate her. She said, you don't have to. I said, I just don't want her in my life. She said, that's allowed. My mother texted later. Daniel is moving again. I didn't respond. My father called once. I let it ring. I felt no guilt, only calm. I realized something important. Regret doesn't undo harm. Apologies don't restore trust. Some bridges burn completely, and rebuilding them only leads back to fire. That night, I looked around my apartment. It felt like mine. I whispered to myself, forgiveness is internal. I didn't need reconciliation to heal. I needed distance, truth, and choice. Regret had finally knocked on their doors. I didn't open mine. I went to the family gathering knowing something would break. My mother greeted me with a tight smile. Thank you for coming, she said. I replied, I'm here. Relatives filled the house, laughing and eating. Someone asked, where's Emily? My father answered quickly, she couldn't make it. Daniel arrived late, already tense. He barely looked at me. I nodded once. He didn't nod back. We sat around the table. An uncle said, family is everything. My cousin laughed, especially when times are hard. Daniel clenched his jaw. My mother said, Let's not start. Daniel snapped. Start what? The room went quiet. He looked at me and said, You think you're better than us. I said calmly, I think honesty matters. He laughed sharply. You want honesty? My father said, Daniel, stop. Daniel stood up. No, he said. I'm tired of pretending. Everyone stared. My mother whispered, Please. Daniel pointed at me. He left his wife, he said. Gasps filled the room. Someone asked why. Daniel shouted, Because she's pregnant with my child. Silence crashed down. My mother covered her mouth. My father turned pale. Questions exploded. What did he say? Is that true? Emily. Daniel kept talking. They all knew, he said, pointing at my parents. They made him stay quiet. My aunt looked at me. Is this true? I met her eyes. Yes. My voice didn't shake. Someone asked, Why didn't you tell us? I said, I was told silence protected the family. My father stood up. This is not the place, he said. I looked at him and said, You chose this place when you chose silence. My mother cried. We were scared, she said. I answered, so was I. My cousin asked, Why are you so calm? I said, Because the truth already burned me once. Daniel shouted, You're acting like a victim. I said, I was betrayed. He said, You abandoned us. I said, I walked away. He said, You ruined everything. I said, I stopped lying. People murmured. An uncle said, That takes courage. Daniel laughed bitterly. You're enjoying this. I said, I'm done hiding. My mother tried to touch me. Please, she said. I stepped back. I'm not here to punish anyone, I said. I'm here because I won't lie anymore. My aunt asked, Did you forgive them? I said, I forgave to heal. She asked, Did you reconcile? I said, No, the room stayed quiet. Daniel looked around wildly. Say something, he told my parents. My father stared at the table. My mother sobbed. Daniel shouted, They protected me. I said, They sacrificed me. Someone whispered, That's wrong. My cousin said, Why would you do that? My father finally said, We thought it was best. I answered, It was best for you. Questions kept coming. How long? Did she live with him? Did everyone know? I answered each one. Months. Yes. Only them. I didn't add emotion. I didn't raise my voice. I simply told the truth. People looked at me differently now. Not with pity, with respect. Daniel slammed his fist on the table. You wanted this, he said. I replied, I wanted peace. He said, You destroyed the family. I said, Lies did. My uncle said, Enough. Daniel looked at me one last time. You think you won, he said. I answered, I think I'm free. I stood up. My mother said, Don't go. I said, I'm done here. My father said my name softly. I looked at him and said, You taught me to be quiet. I paused. I unlearned it. I picked up my jacket. No one stopped me. As I walked out, I heard voices arguing behind me. Accusations. Crying. Anger. I didn't turn around. Outside, the air felt light. My phone buzzed with messages. I didn't check them. I sat in my car and breathed. My hands were steady. Mark called. How did it go? He asked. I said the truth came out. He said, And you? I said, I stayed calm. He laughed softly. That's power. I agreed. Sarah texted, Thinking of you. I replied, I'm okay. And I was. I realized something as I drove away. Power didn't come from revenge. It came from truth. I didn't expose them out of anger. I didn't protect them out of fear. I stood in reality. That changed everything. For years, silence controlled me. That night, honesty set me free. I left the chaos behind without carrying it. My dignity stayed with me. The road ahead felt clear. The judge looked at me and said, This divorce is final. I nodded and said, Thank you. Emily didn't look at me. Outside the courtroom, she whispered, This feels unreal. I said, It feels finished. She said, I hope you find peace. I answered, I already started. She walked away without another word. I didn't follow. My mother called that evening. I let it ring. My father sent a message saying, We should talk. I deleted it. I told myself, Distance is not punishment. Saying it made my chest lighter. I went home and sat alone. The silence felt calm now. It wasn't heavy anymore. It felt earned. Sarah came over with coffee. How did it go? She asked. I said, It's done. She waited. I added, I feel free and scared. She smiled. Both make sense. I asked, does it get easier? She said slowly. I liked that she didn't promise miracles. We talked for hours. She said, what do you need right now? I thought and said time. She nodded. I can give you that. I said, most people try to fix me. She replied, I'm not here to fix you. That mattered more than she knew. Mark called later. You really did it, he said. I said, I finished something. He laughed. I knew you would. I told him, I don't feel like a victim anymore. He said, good. I asked, what do I feel like then? He said, alive. I smiled. I started noticing small changes. I slept through the night. I ate without guilt. I stopped checking my phone for messages that wouldn't come. When my mother texted again, I replied, I need space. She answered, that hurts. I wrote back, so did silence. I didn't wait for her response. Sarah and I took walks after work. She said, you don't flinch anymore when your phone buzzes. I said, I turned off the noise. She asked, do you miss them? I answered honestly, I miss who I thought they were. She said, that's normal. One night, I told her, I blamed myself for too long. She asked for what? I said, for trusting people who broke me. She shook her head. Trust isn't a flaw, she said. It's a risk. I let that sink in. I thought about revenge sometimes. Not violent thoughts, just ideas of winning. Then I realized something. I already won. I wasn't trapped anymore. I said out loud, freedom is quieter than revenge. Sarah smiled. But stronger, she added. My father sent one last message. We raised you better than this. I replied, you raised me to be silent. I blocked his number after that. My hands didn't shake. I felt steady. Therapy became about growth instead of pain. My therapist asked, who are you now? I said, someone with boundaries. She said, and how does that feel? I answered, uncomfortable and right. She nodded. Sarah asked me one evening, what scares you now? I said, losing myself again. She said, then don't. I laughed softly. I'm learning. She said, I see that. We cooked dinner together. She asked, do you believe people can change? I said, yes. She asked, did they? I said, not in time. She said, and you? I said, I did. I looked in the mirror one morning and didn't turn away. I said to myself, you survived. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple and true. Mark joked one day, you're boring now. I smiled. Peace looks boring to chaos. He raised his coffee. To boring. I raised mine back. Sarah asked, do you think about the baby? I paused. Sometimes, I said. Then I remind myself it's not my story. She nodded. That's healthy. I stopped replaying conversations in my head. I stopped imagining apologies that wouldn't come. I stopped explaining myself to people who didn't listen. One night, Sarah asked, what does justice mean to you now? I thought carefully. Justice is waking up without fear, I said. It's choosing my life. She smiled. That's powerful. I realized pain had reshaped me. It sharpened my edges, but didn't harden my heart. I could still care without sacrificing myself. I could still love without disappearing. As we sat quietly, Sarah leaned against me and said, you don't have to rush. I said, I'm not. For the first time, I truly meant it. I wasn't a victim anymore. I was a survivor learning how to live. Slowly, honestly, freely. I received one final message from my parents that morning, asking for forgiveness. My mother wrote, we know we failed you. My father added, we want to talk. I stared at the screen and said out loud, I hear you. I didn't feel angry. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt steady. I typed, I've moved on. Then I added, I wish you peace. I pressed send and sat back, breathing slowly, feeling my hands stay calm, my chest quiet, my mind clear for the first time in years. Silence followed, and I accepted it without flinching, explaining, justifying, or waiting. I watched the phone remain still. No calls, no accusations, no guilt. I told myself, this is enough. Sarah texted, how are you? I replied, calm. She wrote, proud of you. I smiled and answered, thank you for listening. She said, anytime. I realized forgiveness didn't require access. It required honesty. I wasn't closing a door. I was choosing a room with air. I stood up, stretched, and said, I'm okay. The words didn't wobble. They stayed true. I trusted them completely without fear, without doubt, without rehearsal. Peace felt ordinary, and that made it powerful, durable, earned, finally mine. I thought about everything I'd lost and everything I'd gained. I said quietly, betrayal broke the illusion. Then I added, it saved me. Mark called and joked, you sound lighter. I said, I am. He asked, no anger left? I answered, not the kind that owns me. He laughed and said, that's growth. I agreed. I stopped bleeding, I told him. I stopped hiding. He replied, that takes courage. I corrected, it takes truth. We hung up, and I felt settled. The past no longer chased me. It stayed behind, quiet, contained, finished, ended, released, dissolved, gone, irrelevant, powerless, done. I walked through my apartment slowly. The walls were bare, the space small, but it was mine. I said, no more secrets. I remember dinners filled with lies and said, never again. I didn't hate my parents. I didn't excuse them. I understood something simple. They chose comfort over truth. I chose myself. I looked out the window and whispered, I'm free. The city answered with noise. I didn't need silence anymore. I needed honesty. I needed space. I needed my voice. It sounded steady now. It didn't shake. It didn't apologize. It existed without permission. That realization grounded me. Sarah came by later. She asked, did you respond? I said, yes. She waited. I added, I kept it simple. She smiled and said, that's healthy. I told her, I'm not reopening wounds. She replied, you're closing them. I breathed in deeply. I don't need apologies, I said. I need peace. She nodded. You look whole. I answered, I feel whole. We sat quietly. No fixing. No pressure. Just presence. I realized love could be gentle. It didn't have to hurt to feel real. I chose to believe that. The choice felt safe, solid, patient, mutual, honest, balanced, warm, enough. I opened my laptop and deleted old drafts. Messages I'd never sent. Arguments I'd rehearsed. I said, no more explanations. My story didn't need defending. I wasn't wrong for leaving. I wasn't cruel for choosing life. I whispered, I survived. The word fit. I closed the computer and felt lighter. There was nothing left to prove. I thought about silence. How it once choked me. Now it rested. I controlled it. I used it wisely. Silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was choice. It was boundary. It was mine. That shift mattered. It changed everything. I smiled softly, alone, content, complete. My parents didn't reply. I didn't check. I made dinner and played music. I told myself, this is living. I remembered nights of ceilings and fear. I said, not anymore. I chose slow mornings, honest conversations, clear endings. I wasn't carrying anyone else's shame. I wasn't holding secrets for love. I finally understood something. Loyalty without respect is self-betrayal. I promised myself, never again. The promise felt solid. It didn't scare me. It steadied me. I believed it. I practiced it. I lived it. The habit formed quickly. Relief followed. Strength followed. Confidence followed. I welcomed them all openly, freely. I stood in the center of the room. Boxes unpacked. Windows open. I said, this is my life. I wasn't running anymore. I wasn't hiding. I acknowledged the truth. Betrayal changed me. It stripped illusions. It revealed strength. I didn't destroy my family. I stopped protecting lies. That difference mattered. I felt whole because I chose honesty. I chose myself. I chose to speak. My voice filled the space. It sounded right. It sounded real. I wasn't afraid of echoes. I welcomed them. The past couldn't touch me. I stood firm, grounded, present, aware, breathing, steady, resolved, alive, awake, free. I remember the man I was. Quiet, afraid, loyal to pain. I thanked him. He got me here. I said, you can rest. Growth didn't erase scars. It gave them meaning. I felt proud. Not loud pride. Calm pride. I earned it. I chose healing when silence stopped working. I chose truth when lies demanded loyalty. That choice saved me. I looked around and smiled. Nothing was missing. No one was owed anything. I stood complete. I accepted that. The acceptance stayed. It didn't fade. It settled deep. I breathed easily. I lived honestly. I finished this chapter peacefully whole. I spoke once more. I stopped bleeding in silence. The words felt final. I didn't need witnesses. I didn't need applause. My life continued quietly. That was the victory. I sent no more messages. I waited for nothing. I lived. Sarah squeezed my hand. "You okay?" she asked. I said, "Yes." She smiled. "Good. I meant it. I wasn't proving anything. I was being. That was enough." I stepped forward. Not fast. Not afraid. Just steady. The future opened. I entered it willingly. No chains. No lies. No silence. Only truth. Chosen, spoken, lived, owned, protected, honored, kept, trusted, free. I closed the door gently. The sound didn't echo. It didn't need to. I leaned against it and laughed softly. "I made it," I said. The room held me. I held myself. No one interrupted. No one demanded. I respected that. I respected me. The night felt kind. I turned off the light. Darkness wasn't scary. It was restful. I slept easily. Dreams didn't chase me. Morning waited patiently. I welcomed it. Life moved on. So did I, stronger, clearer, honest, awake, ready. I carried nothing extra. I carried truth. It fit perfectly. I smiled once more, certain, steady, done. I stood again in my apartment. Sunlight crossed the floor. I said, "This is peace." Betrayal didn't end me. It redirected me. I didn't lose myself. I found myself. I didn't destroy my family. They chose their path. I chose mine. I stopped bleeding quietly. I spoke. I lived. I healed. The story ends here. Not in anger. Not in regret. In truth. In choice. In freedom. I stood whole. I remained whole. I will stay whole. That promise felt real. I kept it. I keep it. I always will. The silence ended. My life began. Strong. Honest. Open. Mine.